with respect to that and not having a quorum.
You could discuss it if you want. Obviously, you'd want as many people participating as you can, but obviously, like you stated, since there's not a quorum, you can't take any actions. We would defer to you whether you would want to continue with any type of a discussion, even if it's abbreviated. At least we could get the input from those that are currently in attendance, and then we could put this on the next agenda and hear what the others have to say after we've had a chance to contemplate participating as your comments.
Okay.
Obviously, like you stated, since there's not a quorum, you can't take any actions. We would defer to you whether you would want to continue with any type of a discussion, even if it's abbreviated. At least we could get the input from those that are currently in attendance, and then we could put this on the next agenda. And
all right, thank you for that guidance. And I was hearing a bizarre audio effect with my voice echoing in the background, even though I was on mute. So I don't know if somebody has a delay on their setup. Well, I'm a little bit conflicted on this one. I want to be respectful of everyone's time who has set aside their evening to fulfill this duty and commitment. And I also want to ensure that we have a robust conversation with some of these topics that I think are important for the future of the city. So I'm inclined maybe to open the session and collect the input as Steve had mentioned of those that are here, recognizing that we can't take action today. And I'm kind of thinking we do that, and it'll likely be a short session, but we'll at least get started on a few of the conversation points that are outlined in the agenda items. That's my feeling. If anyone feels strongly otherwise, I am open to input, but that's kind of what I'm thinking right now.
We support you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Well, let's not hesitate any longer then. Teresa, if you want to go ahead and start the recording, I will open up as soon as you give me the signal.
All right, we've started the recording and also our YouTube.
All right, thank you, Teresa. I'd like to welcome everyone out to our second virtual Planning Commission meeting. Today is Tuesday, May 19th, 2020. Thank you all for joining this evening. For those of you on the YouTube, welcome. And today will be a little bit different, obviously, with the technology that's enabling this type of meeting. Hope everybody is well and safe out there. We do not have a quorum as a planning commission this evening. We need 4 members, and we have 3 that are available tonight. And so that means we will not be taking action and voting on some of our minutes that from our prior session back in April, as well as taking action on any of the agenda items. We will discuss them though, and we'll jump into that here in just a moment. A few matters of housekeeping. Just a reminder for those of you in the live Zoom meeting, please keep your set on mute unless you're speaking, just to minimize distraction. And remember that this meeting is being recorded and broadcast through the YouTube channel, so keep that in mind as well. With that, we will move forward with our agenda for this evening. Now, a couple of changes. The agenda has been amended where we no longer have a discussion about the conditional use permit, and we will not be reviewing our minutes. So there are 2 items on the agenda tonight that we were looking to spend some time discussing and potentially looking at what could create a better set of ordinances and code for Morgan City with respect to future developments and projects that come into the city. So the first one is a discussion around an amendment or potential amendment to 10-22-50 development standards in Chapter 5F. And this is in regards to points of ingress and egress for developments, residential developments. And what I'd like to do, and I think all of us are aware of last session, we gave a recommendation to the city council to approve the final approval for the Pheasant Run subdivision off of the Wasatch Shadows subdivision. And that particular project, due to some confusion throughout the development process, brought to light an opportunity for us to revisit this particular section of code. And that opportunity was, it wasn't clear, whether that first or second, the second point of access to the development needed to be a fully improved roadway with the same widths as any other road coming in and out of the subdivision, or if it just needed to be an emergency access, fire access. And as we progressed through the project, we came to clarity on that it just needed to have that emergency fire access and not a fully improved road. And so that brought to light the question, well, should it? And that's part of the conversation on the table tonight. Weston has spent some time reviewing other code and the way other cities have handled some of this same type of consideration. And so if you wouldn't mind, Weston, providing us an overview of what you've discovered and maybe where that sits right now, so that we can consider that and offer any additional insight as we begin our discussion on this topic.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that, I went through, and I provided a couple examples in the staff report that gives you some ideas of some ways that we can handle this. But it's a common, at least from what I've been able to see, it's a common thing for cities to turn to the fire code standards. So actually, let me back up really quick. So just a point of full clarification. This Pheasant Run subdivision was reviewed by multiple planners and through a transition process where I finally came in at the end. And part of that came with some, me coming up to speed on a lot of different things. So the requirement where we're quoting the 1022-050, after we looked into that a little further, that's really just regulating the sensitive lands, pardon me. And so there's not a specific standard that points to the fire access requirement or a second road access in the code, except for sensitive lands. And so the reason that fire access was there was because of the International Fire Code. And that, so that 20-foot access that they put in did meet that access requirement by the fire code. So that's where that came from. A lot of cities do rely on that, and just by virtue of the projects end up getting the full road. Given the project that, specific to Pheasant Run, that wasn't something that was going to work out just because of how much property they had access to. And so the 20-foot came into place. Pushing an ordinance that would require the additional access after a specific number of lots, or setting an access requirement, just period, having a secondary access for all development, those are some options that you can look at. And moving forward, that would just basically limit whether development could or could not go in and how it could go in the future. So I provided a couple examples. Syracuse City gives an interesting example. What they do is at 35 homes, they require a second ingress egress access road that's a full access road. They do offer the exception that alternatives can be, looked at and approved through the Planning Commission and City Council. Another option is South Weaver. South Weaver does it, just absolutely requires an ingress and egress for all subdivisions and condominium projects. And again, they have a stipulation that, mitigating circumstances, a single access may be the only way to go. So there could be additional fire requirements that could be held to, and increase the ability to get in and out of the project with just a single access based on approval from city council and planning commission. The other aspect of this I thought would be an important part of this discussion is to really talk about block length. That's not something that's a specific standard. We do have some standards outlined in the sensitive lands. We don't have any specific standards related to a block length or to cul-de-sac lengths. Those are both things that, depending on how you do them, can force connectability throughout the city. At least my experience with Morgan so far is that cul-de-sacs are harder to plow, they're harder to service, and so they're not as desirable. So there could be something that we can do to encourage more blocks, not necessarily straight blocks. They can have curves to them. We're more looking at the length. In the chart that I provided in your staff report, it gives you a basic breakdown of what block lengths and cul-de-sac lengths could look like, and the number of homes that you could see on those street lengths based on the frontage requirement, or excuse me, based on the lot width requirement. So there's a lot of different things to kind of go through here. I kind of want to pause and just give opportunity for anybody to comment and spur the discussion in one way or the other, but that's just the general topic and discussion that I've looked into.
Thank you, Weston. That's a great overview. I would be interested in hearing some discussion among the members here today, particularly where it's kind of outlined the extremes. We could do nothing, leave it as is. We could go the South Weber path and require 2 points of access for everything. We could do something in between. And it's an interesting piece with the cul-de-sac. I hadn't considered that before, so I'm glad that came out. A cul-de-sac is essentially a dead end. So how long is this thing before it requires or triggers, some additional form of access? So a good call out there, and I'm glad you brought that up in this research. Thank you, Weston. As far as those that are here, knowing what we experienced with previous projects and what we might want to consider as a code revision to recommend to the city council. What are your thoughts on this particular topic?
This is something I kind of scratched my head on, this whole limiting lots and all that off of a single access. I know long before I was a planning commission member of the subdivision behind my home, I would have loved to have seen it had 2 accesses, so all the traffic isn't going by my bedroom window. Maybe break it up some. And then I look up on the hill above me, the Mahogany Ridge thing, and the potential for growth farther up the hill. And, I know we maybe would limit a new subdivision because of a single access, but, if we start limiting subdivisions, do we start limiting other things? I mean, I did a quick count this afternoon, and I count well over 100 homes down 300 West or the Island Road with a single access. So if we're going to limit a new subdivision and say you have to have 2 access, at what point are we saying nothing more on the Island Road until there's another access? Does that kind of tie over somehow, or nothing else on Mahogany Ridge until there is another access to 700 East? So by doing it, something with a new subdivision, do we limit ourselves in any other areas like that?
That's an interesting perspective, and one that I think we should make sure that we understand and clarify whether those parameters are in scope and out of scope of what we're talking about. So for example, if I'm hearing you correctly, Lance, um, the Island Road, once you hit a certain point, is a single point of access for every other home that's beyond that. But if there's a subdivision that goes in on the Island Road that can connect to different access points within itself, is that okay? And I guess that's the question: is how big does this need to be? Because you take that to an extreme, and the entire city could have one access point, and we've got several through our different canyons, but let's use Pheasant Run, since that's one of the subdivisions that brought this to the commission. Yeah, they have that access point, their official access point off, I think it was 525 West, or whatever that was. If they had a second access point, that might not have been what we're calling the Island Road, and I forget if that's 700, whatever it was. But let's say they had two ways to connect through Wasatch Shadows, but never once connect off the Island Road. What would that meet the spirit of the law as far as what we're potentially considering? And so to your point, I think we need to identify scope of how major of a road counts. Is the Island Road a big enough throughway that anything is built off that, as long as it's internal to itself and has two access points, qualifies? I think we'd want to consider that as well in the development process. What other thoughts as you think about this? And part of it could be, I had asked for this to be on the agenda just based on the experience we had with the Pheasant Run subdivision and subsequent feedback and information that felt like it warranted us taking a look at this. And the original question I'd asked is should we? So we're talking about it now, but where do you fit on the spectrum of, is everything fine as is and let's not rock the boat? Or, we may not have the answer what the new language should be proposed and look like, but we should do something. What are people's thoughts on even taking action on this item in the first place?
I may just insert one more thing.
Sure.
Just to bring you a reminder that the fire code, the IFC, will require the secondary access after 30 units. So there is still some level of a threshold set by the fire code. Now, that could easily be met by the next subdivision that comes in, and they may say, well, we have a second access, that's not a big deal. It may be more uncommon to come up with the situation that we ran into with Pheasant Run, but I think what you're balancing between is potentially requiring a secondary access that's a full road, or relying on the fire code to say, well, we need at least 20 feet, and then we deal with an emergency access.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying.
Mr. Chairman, I have a few thoughts that might help the conversation just from a random perspective. I don't think it's a bad idea to rely on the fire code. I think it, in all reality, I mean, if there's an issue with putting out fires or something, and we have issues with access, I think that's a good place to fall back to. I would be sensitive of the city's requirement in maintaining things like cul-de-sacs. I think if there's an excessive burden there put on the resources, that we may want to look for some way to be a good partner with the resources, and so I'm sensitive of that. And I agree. I agree with what Lance was saying about there's a big precedence that's already been set. Like, I mean, I live at a one access Red Rock that goes down into a dead end zone. Personally, I like the dead end zones. I like the roads that don't go through. I like how the cars slow down. I like how the children play in the roads and the cars know that this is, kid zone kind of thing. It's very family friendly, some of those things. And so I feel like there's some precedence that has been set prior to us with a bunch of these things that Lance describes. And I feel like common sense in my mind is like, I would just defer to common sense. Like if we have an issue with putting out a fire, then we should amend and fix that. But I like family friendly zones, but I don't want to be a burden to the city. And so to me, I kind of feel like it's good that we have this conversation about that topic, but I don't personally feel there's any problem with what Pheasant Run has done. I feel like they've kind of been in line with all the other developments in the area that I live in and a lot of things that Lance sees. And so I would have a hard time causing somebody to have two major points of access unless there was, some very distinct reason why we should impose that. And if that were for some common sense reason, I'd be in favor of that. If that were an increased maintenance cost to the city or a fire issue or something like that. But other than that, I support where we have been and where we currently are personally.
Thank you for that. Just a couple of thoughts that your thoughts sparked for me is when I think about, is there a need for this? The first thing that comes to mind is just traffic flow. It's better traffic flow, in my opinion, to have multiple points of access. And I think some of the things that you said, Jay, are actually an argument for why we would want that. For example, you like the family-friendly, slow street that you enjoy there in Red Rock. And one could make the argument that so do the people in Wasatch Shadows. And now they've got a subdivision that's coming in that you're going to bring in the traffic of 40 more homes that are now zipping by their house every day, where it used to be a quiet neighborhood. And instead of coming in off Island Road, they're coming in off 525 West or whatever that was. And same thing could happen at Red Rock. An adjacent property gets developed, single point of access, and now you've got double, triple the traffic coming by your house because that's the only way in and out of the neighborhood. So in my mind, having the multiple points of access improves traffic flow and keeps from having any single point become a major thoroughfare where all the traffic for the entire subdivision is coming in and out of that only spot. So for me, that's an argument for making a change as opposed to leaving it the same.
I like that. I appreciate that because you're right. The people at the front of Red Rock experience more traffic than I do at the back. And I think that's a great point that you make. And thank you.
David, I can't tell if you're speaking or
I did what you told me. I put it on mute. I just saying, Jay, Dan Goodrich may not consider his location family friendly.
I agree. It's not,
All right. What other thoughts do people have on this? This is the first time we've chatted about it. Weston did some research, and in our packets, obviously, we've got these examples that he reviewed for us to spend some time looking at. We can't make decisions tonight to further progress this, but I do want to at least get anyone else's thoughts on this particular concept. Obviously, we will revisit this when we have a quorum and we can make a determination of whether to recommend something to come before the city council. But any other thoughts on this particular item before we have a similar conversation about the next item?
Here, I have a couple of comments. I'm not on the planning commission, but just from my own perspective. One thing is that secondary access doesn't necessarily guarantee use. So we have this idea that having 2 points means that the traffic's going to be distributed equally, even though one might just become the main access point based on people's habits wherever they're coming or going to. The other item I wonder, and this is maybe a question for Weston, is in the ordinance or review process, is there something that indicates a capacity study based on our own transportation plan? So if you're building off of a collector, that should look differently than going past, like what Lance was saying, on the street next to his house, leads to nowhere and was never intended to connect different parts through the city, right? So if you're building off of Young Street, that Young Street has a lot more capacity, and it's designed that way on purpose. So if you're a subdivision building off of Young Street, the Red Rock example is 100 South probably at one point was a quiet little subdivision road, but coming off of State Street to 100 South, that transitioned into kind of a collector. And there are subdivisions peeling off of 100 South, and over time, that might be our transportation plan in the long term, is to, these roads do go somewhere. And the recent one that we just approved, I think, was building off of a road that is planned to be a through street to connect back up to 400 West. But I just wondered, is that something that we look at when we consider secondary accesses or number of streets or anything, the impact of the current roads? Like, do we go back and say this is the impact or the capacity of the road they're building off of? Or do we just simply say, oh, that's the number of homes, has to have 2 access points? Because I'm more interested in the logic part of going through that process and figuring out, okay, even if we have a secondary access, is it even going to get used? Because I don't want the city to own roads just for the sake of owning roads, because they're expensive, and we're not keeping up with maintaining the ones that we currently have. And if we have X amount of miles of road for every 10 houses, property taxes at some point are going to have to accommodate that. So anyway, to me, it just seems like it's hard to make an ordinance that's going to fit in every situation and just say, yeah, we do I think it was the South Weber thing, where that could turn out poorly for the city as well. But maybe I don't know. I've talked way too long, but I think I kind of made my point on maybe there's a variance or a difference based on the capacity that we're looking at.
I think that's a great point, and glad you contributed, Ty. And I think if we look at what's been discussed, and as a general rule, I tend to favor simplicity over complexity when it comes to these types of planning principles. So I don't know that I want to have a code where we've created a complex formula that may or may not apply in any given situation, and it's hard to follow, and it may not have any common sense to it other than it's mathematically sound. So I like the idea of simplicity. On the other hand, I don't think we want to be so simplistic that we don't have any foresight. Think about the types of situations that Lance had brought up, that Ty that you just mentioned. And I think the capacity of the collector road is an important consideration. Weston bringing up the consideration with a cul-de-sac, which qualifies for these same types of conversation. How big can a cul-de-sac be? Because it's essentially the same thing. Lance and Ty kind of touched on some of the same points. I love this part of the conversation and thinking, what is appropriate as we look at our city and the things that make sense from planning principles. When I look at something like Pheasant Run, if we had a road coming in off of Island Road, my prediction would be that road would get the volume. To your point, Ty, that not each access point is going to get the same distribution of volume. I would predict it would come off the larger collector versus within the subdivision. And is that what we want? And in this case, if you're building a 400 or 500 foot access point, that's just a road that you have to maintain and plow and curb and gutter and extend utilities and whatever else we do with them, then that may not be appropriate. If it's better for traffic flow and it's a more logical, ingress egress point, then it feels like that may be worth exploring more. And that's I think that common sense test. And in this case, when I'm thinking about it, and again, it's one person's opinion, but I would, if I were driving home to that community, I would come in off Island Road if I could, as opposed to weaving through 4 or 5 different turns to get through Wasatch Shadows first and then get into my home. Even though the long-term plan is that road is a through road, we don't know how long that'll take. That could be a couple of years as these properties become developed. That could be 20 years. I don't know. And so, is it something that we're comfortable living with in the near term, because we don't know how long it's going to take to come to fruition.
I think Ty brought up a great point right there. Like, our near-term vision limits us so much, right? Like, what do I want selfishly for my neighborhood? I feel like the general plan is so much more important based on what he just said. It's like, if you can just imagine the entire place being 100% developed at full capacity, what would you like it? What would it need to be? Instead of this micro, what is it right now, and how might it change in the future? Because if we were looking at this as the valley, we're 100% developed right now, whether that's a full access road or not, I think the things we've discussed tonight, it's a no-brainer that's a full access road. Because the plan is, that's not the end of the line. Just like we discovered in Red Rock, this may not be the end of the line. It may branch out to 100 South on 2 different wings. But our limited view says, well, if it doesn't get developed for 20 years, why wouldn't we just want to have one access? That's the problem. So if we're the planning commission, we've got to look at 100% capacity on every decision and imagine if it were 100% capacity, how would it flow? And then that lets us eliminate our limited vision of what about 1 year, what about 2 years kind of thing. And so I feel like Ty made the answer right there. Like, we already know that Pheasant Run isn't the end of the line, right? Those fields are going to be developed more. And if they're going to be developed more, we just got the answer. I feel like that has to be a secondary access. I'm done.
Jay, Lance, thank you both for offering your perspective as members of the commission. Anybody else have anything to add to this part of the conversation prior to transitioning to the next item?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit on Jay's thought there. And I don't know that I have enough planning experience to even argue why I would feel this way, but suppose you had a city that was built out of subdivisions. For whatever reason, I think I'd feel more comfortable with if subdivisions had secondary access than if subdivisions had no access. And maybe it's just for an ease of moving around, just an ease of getting around. So I think what we're trying to do, of course, is find somewhere, in between. But a concern I would have, and Weston, this maybe be directed to you, and this is just throwing this out for future discussion or down the road, that you mentioned in the staff report that both options provide a way to require and allow for exceptions to the secondary access requirement. it would seem to me we want to have some direction on what exceptions were. Otherwise, you're going to just water down the ordinance if you say we need secondary access, but anything that comes along is an exception. So probably some further guidance on that would be helpful too. But again, a discussion for down the road for future time.
Yeah, thank you. I think when we bring this up next, we'll, one thing Teresa's indicated, she'll be sending out the future road plan so that we can use some of the thoughts that have been shared tonight in consideration with this conversation moving forward. Summarizing some of the other points with collector roads, with cul-de-sacs and what's been discussed. To this point, I think we'll summarize those key points so that we're not starting from scratch when we resume this conversation, but we'll have a continuance of these points and get the perspective of those that weren't able to meet here tonight due to various reasons. All right, with that, speak now or we're moving on. Let's jump to item 2. Now, item 2, and I won't attempt to identify as much of a summary on this one. Weston, I'll let you jump in. This is for 10-14-070, a part of the code, and ties to setbacks and some of the provisions with the developments, particularly rear setbacks, if I recall. But Weston, I'd like you to provide an overview of what's being proposed or for today's conversation and potentially an amendment to this part of the ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so what we're looking at here is there's a couple components that are very basic standard setbacks, or excuse me, height requirements that we just don't have in our code. And then some additional setbacks that are worth to consider. So within the very first part of the staff report, if you see that there's a chart laid out, currently in the municipal code, there's not a height limit for residential. That's single family and multifamily. Now, as you can see, I just took a general cut from some cities in the region, and it's pretty standard that 35 feet is the maximum across the board for multifamily and single family. That 35 feet ends up functioning differently because of roof pitches. This height is typically taken at mid-peak. And as you can see, there's a few cities that on single families, they'll say 35 feet or 2.5 stories. So it would be good to have some regulation on the single families. It's a pretty standard regulation to place on the code. As far as multifamilies go, we start getting into one, it would be good to have a regulation on height. We obviously are going to have seen and will continue to see more multifamily buildings and requests come into the city. And so we want to be able to answer clearly what height they can build to. That also leads to, well, what does the buffer look like between a 3-story townhome and a 14-foot Rambler single-family home subdivision that's right next to it? And obviously that's not always the situation, but it's important to consider those differences where townhomes create a little bit more of a medium density, and your single family is not a medium density, it's a lower density. How does that transition work? So that's one of the things that the report covers. I basically cover, you have some options, and there's more obviously than what I presented, but there's a couple things you can do. For instance, we could require, if you have a maximum of 35-foot multifamily, if the units are within 40 feet or even more of a single family development, those units have to be dropped to 28 feet to help a little bit more of a transition into a lower density. The other thing that's come up, and that's a part of this, is within the RM7 and RM15, we have we'll get buildings. This is the Riverstone townhome is a good example of this. We'll have buildings that are on the same property. They share the same common space. And we have front to front setbacks. So buildings that front each other, that face each other, there's a specific 50 feet apart requirement. But we don't have any setbacks when it comes to buildings being side to side, rear to rear, front to rear. There's a number of different options that these buildings can be put in based on the shape of the property and how they design it. And that's one of their first questions as the developer is they'll come back and they'll say, well, what are my setbacks? From my understanding, we've previously relied on fire to say, well, what do we need for safety and access? And that's generally come back as 20 feet. So I've left that in there as the starting point. There's room to discuss, if we allow them to be 35 feet tall, is 20 feet too short? Does it need every foot above, X amount of feet, they need to increase their setback? There's a lot of different options. I provided a draft text amendment for you of what that could look like as well, setting the height to 35 feet. Anyway, I'll stop talking. I think you guys can understand where I'm at with that.
Thank you, Weston. Just a couple of questions before we open it up for everyone else's thoughts. And that is the sampling of cities that for the first part of the conversation with respect to the height requirements. Is this a random sampling of nearby cities? And the reason I'm asking is they all happen to kind of converge around 35 feet. So it feels like there's a pretty good baseline there. I don't know if that was by design or just worked out that way. So that's one question.
Yeah, completely random. I tried to look at cities that were in the region that were having growth that was similar, is similar to Morgan, that is not similar to Morgan. So, you have Ogden that's not really building subdivisions. You have South Weber and Weber County and Far West that are building subdivisions. Midway that, is within the realm of being on the Wasatch back. So I tried to cover the basis and without any real foresight of which cities to look at, and that's the numbers that came out.
Okay, thank you. The second question on the multifamily side, maybe some clarification on what's being defined as multifamily. If these are, apartment complex type of structures, it surprises me, just as an example, to see Ogden at 35 feet. I would think there'd be maybe some more high-rise style or condo projects that may exceed 35 feet. So I'm curious how multifamily is being defined for this particular table.
Yeah, I took it from the same, roughly the same density. So Layton's another good example. We actually have other multifamily zones that do not have height requirements. There's, the mixed use zone doesn't have a height requirement. So I took it in context of the density that you can have based on the zones that you're looking at.
Okay, so it's density specific. That's helpful. The last one is with respect to the setbacks, and the question I had there is more just a clarification. I just want to make sure that I'm following completely. We have full coverage of setback requirements when it comes to adjacent properties. But when it comes to structures within an existing lot or property, we don't have the guidance that's been highlighted in this table to, if you have two buildings, side to side, front to back, back to back, what those should be. So I just want to clarify that we're talking about the setbacks within an existing property boundary.
That's correct.
All right, so that's the topic. Thank you, Weston, for clarifying and outlining that for us. Again, we don't have an opportunity this evening to advance this topic or take action, but we can identify some of the the key points that can help us at least set the groundwork for moving forward. So based on what's been shared so far, let me open it up to both the members of the commission and the others that are present from staff and the city council and so on. So feel free to weigh in. It's an open discussion. Let's just chat about this particular issue.
I can make my case real quick. I don't feel like I got the email with the staff report, and so I feel uneducated and I can't make comments on it. And so I'll just tap out and let Lance do his thing, and anybody else go for it. I have 0 comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. And that reminds me, just for those that may be watching this on the YouTube channel or for our own benefit for future reference, the agendas, at least they have been during the COVID era, are published on the Morgan City website, and that includes the full packet with the staffing notes, Jay. So you can access that off the internet, the Morgan City website, go to the Planning Commission link, and there is an area where you can access the agendas and minutes and so on. So it's there for your review, and that's true for commission members and anyone in the public that may be listening. It's public information, so it's out there.
That quickly, I now have the information.
Don't feel too bad. The other day I called Teresa and said, I don't have any of this. And she says, it's on the website, dummy. And then I found it. So
Is that a direct quote, Lance?
no,
She just said it in her mind, you dummy, Jay.
All right, so no worries though, Jay. I didn't find it immediately myself either, but all right, your thoughts, Lance. I interrupted you.
No, you're fine. I think the residential stuff, it's hard, and I've looked at some other charts. Wish I had with me. It's part of the development review meetings, part of in the city, I think, where it about some of the different things, houses on hills and the midpoint and how they measured some of this stuff. And I wished I knew where like part on that, but I think that 35 feet, the single family, if that's what most places are doing, I think it's probably a good guideline for us. One thing I think Weston mentioned, I know it kind of caused me a little bit of I guess maybe heartburn, or it made me think about the Riverstone townhomes. One thing I would like to maybe be able to look at in the future as we get more of those multifamily type things. And the Riverstone townhomes didn't directly border a single family deal like the backside of Island Road. But if we ever did have someone come in and want to do like the multifamily condos, townhouse type thing, I would really like to be able to look into a way that we could, maybe that first row of townhouses next to maybe some single family stuff, cut them down some and make it to where you're all of a sudden not getting that tall apartment looking down in your backyard to maybe lessen the impact on the existing residents. I'm sure at some point in the future, it may not be us, but down the road, I'm sure we're going to run into that where someone's wanting to build a 3-story apartment overlooking a single family, area and subdivision. So,
well, I think that's true, even if it's not overlooking a single family. I think about on Hillfield Road in Layton, next to Northridge High School, where those townhomes went up. It's a pretty stark contrast to have these 2-3-story buildings with this high density right next to the spacious school grounds, and it's kind of a shock to the system just visually. And to your point, that's the kind of thing I think could do well with a buffer.
I guess I kind of picture if maybe if you had a huge development like what you're talking about, maybe in the middle you could have that, but maybe your outside row maybe needs to be a little bit shorter because that's what your eyes drawn to. And maybe then you wouldn't notice the interior stuff with that extra story. I don't know, because this is a tough one.
So let me ask this: Is it the Riverstone project that brought this to light? In other words, what's the burning platform? On our first issue, there was a particular project, and we had a number of back and forth conversation about it. Have we experienced? This is just something we want to be proactive of because we anticipate there could be a problem down the road, and we're getting ahead of that. Or have we experienced something and this is a problem we're trying to solve? What's the burning platform?
What are you talking about specifically, Nathan? The height or the setbacks?
Well, I guess the setbacks in particular is what I was thinking at the moment, but for either one for that matter. Have we run into this where it's been a problem?
I have a question with the heights. This is, I guess, for Weston. We do not have anything in the ordinance as far as height for a single family residence.
No, sir.
That seems odd,
Agreed.
very odd. The only thing the mayor just texted me and I was thinking about the same thing. The other thing that we come up against, and I heard it multiple times with the apartments over by the bowling alley from citizens, constituents in the city, was the ability to fight a fire in a structure like that with limited fire equipment. We don't, for example, have a ladder truck that would reach a certain height. That was one of the comments I heard many times about the apartments being built over to Parkside. But I am surprised about there's no requirement for height on a single family residence. That seems very odd to me. I mean, how would you like to live in a subdivision of 1 or 2 story homes and somebody comes in and puts a 3-story home? I don't know. It just looks so much out of place to me, but that's my thought.
And if I could just address that, Weston and I talked about this, and it's my recollection that at one time that there was, and I think it just in some of the recodifications, we've lost a couple of things. I mean, Weston and I talked about these things, and I have distinct recollection of those being in there. And again, through a recodification process, sometimes those things might get, left on the printer's floor or whatever. But and then back to the chair's question, these are really proactive. Weston has noticed these gaps in the ordinance, and we just need to get them filled.
Thank you, Steve.
Yes. Nate, I would think similarly that we're probably being preemptive. I mean, you look at the cities that Weston's provided there that do utilize the numbers, and as Morgan continues to grow and look more like a larger city, it's probably just good planning. Weston, would there be any reason we wouldn't want to adopt something like this?
No, matter of fact, it's really good foresight. Now, if 35 feet isn't the right answer, I think that's really the question. What's the answer in height? But
yeah, in other words, good planning will suggest that we do something, and then we just need to decide what that is.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
One thing I just got thinking about, I'd be really interested to know, and I think at this point we're in the near future, we're kind of done building on the hill, with the last phase, Mahogany 4 and 5. As you drive up the Mahogany Ridge Road and you look at some of those houses on the steeper portion of that, I think there's some that have 3 daylight stories in the back, and they're not as far out of the ground in the front. And some of those you drive up through there, I wonder how a height limit may have changed some of those homes to make it to where you don't feel like the neighbor up the hill from you has 2 full stories out of the ground above you, and how this is all measured. If maybe that would have kind of toned down the height to some of those houses that just due to the hillside look so massive as you drive up that road, and just for future, if there's ever ground that's annexed in or whatever, more hillside areas, and how that can change the look and kind of level things out on some hillsides in the future.
I think that's a great condition to be thinking about, is when you look at measuring that 35-foot threshold, where do you take the measurement from? What's the grade? Is it the front yard, the backyard? Do you average the two? It should be clarified.
Does I guess maybe Weston, do you know that 35 feet on a hillside type thing, where does that number, where would it can't come up with? Where would you get that from?
Yeah, it's measured from the average grade of the finished. So it's measured from the average finished grade of the highest point of a flat roof, or the decking of a mansard roof, or to the midpoint of a gable, hip, or a gambler roof.
Okay, but when you say average finished grade,
So generally, if you've got different elevations on each corner, you're going to average those out.
both on the roof height as well as the grade of the landscaping where you take your measurement from.
Yeah, so you would
35 feet out of the ground, you could still have, half a story or a full story underground, depending.
Yeah, you would take it from the average grade. So you would generally your two back corners and your two front corners, they're those are going to be the same. So but there have been times where I've measured all four corners, and you take the height from, if one corner from the very bottom to the peak is 43 feet, but on the front you've got 14 feet just because of how the home sits, you'll take all those numbers and then you'll average them together.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I've been able to kind of look at this since I pulled it up on the website, and it just seems to me like it seems like such a crazy math problem, right? Like we've got rows and columns, and I think about it all takes me back to the general plan, really. I feel like there's situations where close proximity is more acceptable than others, and in some areas, we want as much space as possible based on zoning. Until I just constantly feel like it bubbles up to our general plan, really, like, and to have some kind of outline. There's blanks on here that have no value, right? There's no entry in it, and so I don't necessarily know that I feel qualified to be able to say, what setback in what area or different things like that are best. But I do recognize that whatever happens in the general plan, if we decide that area allows for this and that area allows for that and this area allows for that, and whatever transition or buffer zones exist in between, I think it's responsible to just kind of define. I'm anxious and excited about the general plan revision this year, because I feel like the timing, like this is a perfect example that's begging for, well, the general plan will help us answer this question, I kind of feel like. And so I almost would say, once the general plan is defined a little bit better, we could maybe answer this question a little bit easier, because there's going to be some of those areas and transition zones that it would be easier to make some kind of recommendation based on the larger plan, if that makes sense.
Thank you. One thought that I have, I guess, is and maybe this is how it was set up initially, Weston, you can provide more clarity if not, but those gaps that are in the table might be there, not because they weren't thought through, but rather, hey, if it doesn't inhibit, any of the other utility providers or service providers that need, access, whether it's fire access or servicing gas lines and easements and whatever needs to be serviced, as long as all those criteria are met, maybe we don't dictate anything there. It's their piece of America, and the developer can follow the standards in accordance with the other setbacks that are already outlined for, some of these other conditions and adjacent properties. But as long as it's not creating a hazard within the property, do we want to dictate it? And maybe that was part of the initial thinking, or was it a legitimate gap or something, as Steve had mentioned earlier, that maybe in the process of recodification over the years got missed, and this is our opportunity to clean it up.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to put a place on really. I mean, it sounds from Steve's recollection and how long he's been doing this, it sounds like there has been some holes in there that were there and need to be refilled. And my experience with multifamily is that we are seeing a different type of multifamily construction than what used to be built. Not, in a crazy way that's different, but the structures are a little bit different and the densities are a little bit different, and the intensity or the amount of it is a little bit different. And so it's a good point to look at this as part of the general plan, but it's also good to recognize that this may function as a stopgap and say, we may have multifamily housing projects that come into our city within the next year and a half. And what standards do we want to have in place up until that general plan is done, and we can really reevaluate this. This wouldn't be and doesn't have to be something that is a done deal, and this is just how the city decides to do all multifamily. It could very, very well be let's put something in place and come back and revisit this in a year.
What other thoughts with respect to either the building heights for single family, multifamily, and in this case, the setbacks within a property?
I think my biggest thing I think about with this is not even so much in the middle of a development, but as a buffer from someone's home who's been there for 40 years to the new multi-story, multi-family development that someone comes in, maybe gets a zoning change, whatever. I think that a lot of my stuff with these heights and maybe even the setbacks are mostly to protect people and buffer between that different way of living with maybe a single family, single story home, not ending up with a 3-story multi-family 20 feet from their back fence. I think protecting kind of the people who've been there is I guess my thoughts with this, rather than if you have a big development, then what's in the middle of it, I guess.
Thank you. So summarizing a couple of the thoughts so far, one, it feels pretty consistent on the building heights with a single family structure. That 35 feet has been adopted by a number of cities. Although we don't know the why that number was adopted, it's at least consistent, and something that we may want to consider adding, once we have a quorum and can recommend something to the city council. Those measurements and where that takes place and how much of that, on a slope that we talked about where the measurement is above grade and taking the average and the midpoint of the different roof types and those kinds of things are all, I think, valid considerations and something that can impact, I think, the eye appeal or even, whether 35 feet is appropriate or not if you're on a big slope, and, may consider that differently. For multifamily, it's good perspective to understand that that's been equalized or normalized for density, and in mixed use zones, with, different zones, there may not be that height where you can still have the high rise condo in some of the reference cities that were included in the table. Not that we're advocating for that or promoting that in Morgan, but it could, and I like the idea of having all kinds of variety and the different tax base that comes from high density projects and more low density projects, and not just concentrating in one or the other, but providing that kind of variety throughout the city, and those type of projects enable that. With respect to the setbacks, I love what was said. Lance, I think you summarized it better than I have, and that is, the principle is that buffering between projects in general, and those same principles seem to apply internally within a project. Particularly these larger projects and the way that multifamily projects are coming to fruition now versus how they were years ago, and the different types of design and architecture and the way the people live is evolving. So I think it makes a lot of sense not to just leave it as is. And just hearing what I've heard tonight, I think warrants the continued conversation, at least in my opinion, to explore what those buffers would be. And I don't know, Weston, I'm looking at the language here. I don't know if there's a recommendation, with respect to maybe what that should be. The 10, 20, 30 feet versus, if it's an adjacent property as opposed to within the property. But that might be what we'd want to look at is, what makes sense either aesthetically, practically, based on access points, safety, so there's not this narrow alley between between buildings where we might be breeding nefarious activities and different things that could happen, and what do we want? So I think a recommendation on some of those setbacks would be helpful within the property. Those are a few of the things that I've taken away from the conversation so far. I recognize everything that we've chatted about we'll revisit, and so I don't want to keep hashing and rehashing, but I do want to capture any new thoughts that haven't been shared so that we can summarize these, and the next time we talk about it, have a good starting point where we don't have a blank slate, but we've already got some groundwork done as far as the conversation. So any other thoughts that the rest of you have or want to add to this conversation?
Mr. Chair, I've been going to another meeting, so if I could be excused.
Thank you, Steve, for joining. Feel free to attend your other obligation.
Thank you.
Nate, I think there's a feeling that holes need to be filled, and I would suggest maybe even a little bit of urgency to it. Just like maybe Weston said, we never know when a developer may show up and say, this is what I want to do. It'd be nice to have the programs in place to work with.
Yeah, I agree. In Weston, this table and the proposed language that you have, I think, I think is powerful, and it's more a matter of, once we have a full quorum and are able to take some action on this, determine is there anything else with the language that we'd want to discuss differently than what we've chatted about today. Go ahead, Dave.
Maybe a question for Weston. Are these tables that you have there, Weston, are they ranges? Are they recommendations? How does that play out?
Yeah, so on the very last, well, the second last page and the last page, this is the table that's in the code that's tabled, or the title is Tables 3-1 Principal Residential Structures. This is
Okay.
the table that we use for setbacks. The text in red would be the edits, the proposed changes.
Okay.
And so you have a footnote in red as well. And so all the stuff in black, that is existing setbacks. Those are requirements that we're already using in our code. And I should have made that more clear. So I apologize.
No,
So
that's
what-
helpful. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
You bet.
So, yeah, really to maybe update then to change, we're just looking at the edits in red then.
Okay.
That is helpful, and thank you for asking the good question.
The chair, I have a comment, just a perspective one. It's not really I'm not sure on the footage or that sort of thing. I just think about it from a code enforcement perspective, where I think in a multifamily situation, we feel like the setbacks need to separate people, which isn't the same mentality in a single family. So most of us are living in a single family environment, thinking about our separation between neighbors. And when you're in a multifamily housing situation and you have a common wall and you have neighbors above or below you, the physical separation between buildings isn't where the common complaint or the making happy neighbors comes from as much as it does. I'm just thinking of the calls that I get where it's like my neighbors are playing their music too loud for too long, and then I tell them, well, call your landlord or that sort of thing.
Mm.
And so I really like to focus on the safety aspect of, one building not catching another building on fire, what the snow load not impacting the next building, snow removal, fire access, EMS access. But just a comment about the mentality, how we approach multifamily is sometimes through our single family experience and not so much the proximity. It doesn't have to necessarily be there. These people that choose to live in that environment don't mind rubbing shoulders or walking past sharing small spaces. And then my other comment is just how the setback maybe interacts with the overall open space of a development. So I'm okay with maybe buildings preserving more common space in a useful area like a playground or that sort of thing, instead of claiming the distance between buildings as their open space. We go too far between buildings, and the next thing the developer is going to do is say, well, yeah, there's our common space, and that meets our square footage for the entire development, when we could have maybe gained a more useful space like a playground for common areas. So just those are my only two concepts that don't really translate into anything useful. I'm just throwing them.
I think both are good reminders of perspective and looking at these planning principles through through different lenses, which I think is important because we're accommodating, this grid itself is accommodating all different types of zones, and making sure that we take into consideration the different housing types is absolutely appropriate. So I appreciate that comment. Both from a safety and practicality standpoint, and just planning principles in general. So thank you. And those, I think, when we take these notes, and Teresa, maybe I can work with you on how to pass around for our next section on this, the talking points and summaries that we can use to build in these different perspectives and make a determination. What's the next step? What's the action? What do we want to potentially recommend to go before the city council, which I keep referencing, and that's how I understand the pathway to make any changes to these ordinances. We can make the recommendation and work on the language, and then the city council takes it from there and becomes a public session to actually make a change to the ordinance in our code. And if that's not accurate, someone can correct me, because that's the assumption that I've been operating under.
Again, I apologize. My mic is not the best.
You sound good. It's
Now I
fixed. Yeah.
What the process is that as you can stay in the planning commission and do as many meetings that you would like to discuss until an ordinance is drafted to satisfy your recommendations. Then that draft ordinance does require a public hearing in the planning commission. Then it would again go to the city council with a public hearing for a final approval.
Okay. So there'd be 2 public sessions before that became code.
You can keep it in a discussion for as long as you need be, i.e. we've had like the historic guideline review was in the planning commission for quite some time, just because we wanted it ironed out. So however you want to do it.
Okay, thank you. And I think this has been a valuable discussion, and being a discussion, we're exploring, different perspectives and ways to think about this and implications for the city. So it's not something that the last 90 minutes, I don't think have been for naught. I think this is good groundwork and an investment in our future for the city. That being said, we will have follow-up discussion, obviously with more members of the commission that have an opportunity to participate at that point, and before we go to the phase of drafting the ordinance, even though there is some of that language is already before us today. But I don't want to spend the entire night on this if there's nothing new to add. Let me pause, and as long as we've got additional concepts to continue considering, let's air those out so that we can use those as part of our framework moving forward. Let me pause and call now for any other thoughts with respect to this ordinance. Well, it will not be the last time for folks to participate on this topic. We will bring it up in future agendas as a discussion item. So thank you. This evening, we have covered our 2 discussion points. And for those that have been watching on the streaming channel, thank you. And feel free to share any thoughts or perspectives through the proper channels that we can look at as well. Thank you everyone for your participation tonight. Before wrapping up, anything else that needs to come before the commission this evening? That being said, we'll leave it at this point, and I'll declare the meeting adjourned. Thanks, everyone.